Nobody knew it was happening in real time. The audience was laughing. The cameras were rolling. The guest was doing everything right, hitting the marks, landing the jokes, reading the room. And Johnny Carson was smiling that smile, the one that made 30 million Americans feel like they were sitting in the same room with him. But somewhere behind that smile, a decision was already being made. A quiet, irreversible, career-ending decision that would never be announced, never be explained, and never be undone. The guest would find out later, sometimes weeks later, sometimes months, when the calls simply stopped coming. When the bookers suddenly became unavailable. When the invitations evaporated as though they had never existed at all. And the most terrifying part was not that it happened. The most terrifying part was that nobody ever told you why. You just woke up one day and understood, from the shape of the silence around you, that Johnny Carson was done with you. And in the entertainment industry of that era, that was the last thing that ever happened to your career. To understand why one man's disapproval could function as an industry-wide execution order, you have to understand something about the specific texture of American life in the decades when Carson ruled late night, because the world he operated in no longer exists, and its disappearance makes it almost impossible to fully convey what his power actually felt like from the inside. There was no internet. There was no social media platform where a comedian could build a following independently, bypass the gatekeepers, speak directly to an audience without anyone's permission. There were 3 major television networks, and they divided the country's attention between them with a thoroughness that seems almost authoritarian by modern standards. If you wanted to reach America, not a slice of America, not a demographic, not a niche audience that the algorithm had identified as likely to engage with your content, but actual, broad, coast-to-coast America, there were vanishingly few ways to do it. And the most powerful of all of them was a single desk on a single stage in Burbank, California, occupied every weeknight by a man from Nebraska who had turned effortlessly into an art form. At the height of his run, Carson was pulling audiences that modern television producers would consider physically impossible. 15, 18, sometimes 20 million viewers in a single night, all watching the same program, all receiving the same cultural signal about who mattered and who did not. When Carson laughed at your joke, 20 million people laughed with him. When he waved you over to the guest chair after your set, 20 million people understood that you had just been certified. And when he stopped booking you, 20 million people never noticed, which was precisely the point. The erasure was as invisible as it was total. Here is what the documentaries about Carson almost always get wrong. They treat his famous fallouts, with Joan Rivers, with Wayne Newton, with the roster of comedians and performers who found themselves quietly exiled, as though each one were a separate story, a discrete event with its own specific cause and its own isolated consequence. What they miss is the pattern underneath. Because when you pull back far enough to see all of those stories at once, what emerges is not a series of feuds between strong personalities. What emerges is a system. A set of unwritten rules, never posted anywhere, never explained to anyone, but enforced with absolute consistency and zero appeals. Rule 1. Johnny Carson decided who belonged on his stage, and that decision was final. Rule 2. If you had been elevated by Carson, you were now operating inside his ecosystem, and your major professional decisions were expected to reflect that. Rule 3. Surprises were unacceptable. Not scandalous surprises, not dramatic surprises, any surprise. The show ran on precision and control, and anything that disrupted that control, regardless of intent, regardless of whether the disruption was even visible to the audience, was a violation. Rule 4, and this is the one that destroyed the most careers, loyalty was not a feeling in Carson's world. It was a behavior. And the moment your behavior suggested that your loyalty had limits, you learned that his did too. These rules were never written down because they did not need to be. The industry learned them by watching what happened to the people who broke them. And once you understood what had happened to Joan Rivers, you did not need anyone to explain the rules to you. You simply knew. The Joan Rivers story has been told so many times that it has started to lose its edges, started to feel like industry folklore rather than a specific, devastating sequence of events that destroyed one of the most important professional relationships in entertainment history. So let's put the familiar outline aside and look at the thing underneath it. Joan Rivers did not simply leave for another network. Joan Rivers was a woman who had been told, explicitly, by the people who ran NBC, that she was not being considered to succeed Carson when he eventually stepped down. She had been his permanent guest host. She had kept his show running on the nights he took off. She had, in practical terms, been his most trusted professional partner for years. And the network had looked at all of that and decided it was not enough, that when the throne eventually became vacant, it would go to someone else, and she should understand that. So when Fox called with an offer that would make her the first woman to host a major late-night program in American television history, she was not choosing ambition over loyalty. She was choosing survival over a loyalty that, from the network's perspective, had already been declared one-sided. The problem was not the decision. The problem was the phone call she did not make before she made it. Carson found out from someone else. And something in him, something that had nothing to do with business strategy or professional competition, turned completely cold. He hung up the phone when she tried to call. He did not respond to the letters she sent, year after year, hoping for any acknowledgement, any crack in the wall. Her appearances on his show were systematically buried. Her name was removed from the institutional conversation around The Tonight Show with a thoroughness that required active, deliberate effort. And the signal to the rest of the industry was received without needing to be transmitted directly. She was finished. Anyone who wanted to remain in Carson's good graces would treat her accordingly. The message did not need a sender. It simply arrived, and everyone understood it. What Joan Rivers said about Carson in interviews given after his death is the part that almost never makes it into the retrospectives, because it complicates the narrative in ways that are genuinely difficult to hold. She did not describe him as someone who had used her and discarded her. She described him as someone who had genuinely loved her, in the specific, suffocating way that certain powerful people love those they have elevated, with real warmth wrapped around a core of ownership so dense it could not be extracted without destroying the whole thing. She believed, based on years of knowing him, that his fury was not primarily professional. It was personal, in a way that went deeper than any business deal. She thought he had decided, somewhere in the part of himself he never showed cameras, that she was his, that the debt she owed him for what he had done for her career meant that she operated within his permission, that her choices were ultimately subject to his approval. And when she demonstrated that they were not, the response was not the anger of a business rival. It was the response of someone who had experienced a fundamental betrayal of something he considered a bond. She said she would have done anything for one conversation. Just one moment where he would look at her and let her explain. That moment never came. He died in 2005, and she cried publicly, not for the loss of a professional alliance, but for the loss of the first person who had ever truly believed in her, and for the reconciliation that the calendar had now made permanently impossible. There is something in that grief that is more revealing about who Johnny Carson actually was than anything in any tribute special, any award ceremony speech, any carefully managed interview. He was capable of inspiring that kind of love. And he was capable of withholding himself so completely, so permanently, that the person who loved him spent the rest of their life writing letters that never got answered. The Rivers story is the most famous, but it is not the most instructive about how the system actually worked. For that, you need to look at the cases that involved no betrayal, no business competition, no missing phone call, just ordinary human behavior that happened to land wrong inside Carson's specific, peculiarly rigid emotional architecture. Howie Mandel was early in his career, hungry, trying to find the thing that would make him stand out on a stage full of comedians who were all trying to stand out. So he brought a giant stuffed tiger on stage without telling producers. A prop. Harmless, absurd, the kind of thing a young performer does when he has more ambition than judgment. To a different host, this might have been a quirky moment, something to riff on, a bit of spontaneity that made the segment feel alive. To Carson, it was an unacceptable disruption of the show's rhythm, an unauthorized intrusion into the precise, controlled environment he maintained with what people who worked closely with him described as near-obsessive consistency. The invitation never came again. No conversation, no note, no explanation. The door simply closed. Lola Falana was one of the most talented performers of her era, someone who commanded a stage with a presence that was genuinely difficult to look away from. During an appearance on the show, she spoke honestly about what it felt like to navigate the entertainment industry as a black woman during a period when the industry's racism was systemic, pervasive, and almost entirely undiscussed in mainstream media. She was not inflammatory. She was not performing outrage. She was telling the truth with the composure of someone who had been living inside that truth for years. Carson had the platform, the audience, and the cultural authority to amplify that conversation in a way that could have mattered. He chose, instead, to simply not have it again. Lola Falana was never rebooked. The conversation she had started on his couch was never continued. Wayne Newton's chapter in this story is the one that briefly, unusually, broke Carson's preferred mode of silent operation, and the way it broke is worth examining closely because it reveals something about the specific nature of his ego that his public persona was engineered to conceal. Newton and Carson had the easy rapport of two entertainment industry veterans who occupied different territories without threatening each other. Carson owned Late Night from Burbank. Newton owned the Las Vegas stage with a voice and a showmanship that had been selling out venues for decades. When Newton outbid Carson for partial ownership of the Aladdin Hotel, the transaction was, in any objective reading, a normal piece of business. Two wealthy men competing for a commercial property, one of them winning. Newton understood it that way. Carson did not. Carson began incorporating Newton into his monologues, not with the warmth of two industry veterans who could laugh at each other, but with a specific, sustained edge that the people in that room could feel even when the home audience could not. The jokes targeted Newton's appearance, questioned his masculinity, probed at things that had nothing to do with a hotel bidding war. Newton absorbed it for a while, and then he did something almost nobody did in Carson's world. He walked into NBC studios without cameras or publicists and told Carson directly, in person, to stop. The details of that conversation have been described differently by different people who heard about it secondhand. What is not disputed is the outcome. Carson stopped making the jokes. And Newton never sat in the guest chair again. It was the one moment in Carson's career when someone pushed back openly and immediately, and Carson's response was characteristic. Not escalation, not public confrontation, but the permanent withdrawal of access. He had been challenged, and he accepted the challenge terms by simply removing himself from the relationship entirely. The man who enforced all of these rules, who maintained this invisible architecture of approval and exile for 30 years, grew up as a skinny kid in Norfolk, Nebraska, doing card tricks for his family at 12 years old and calling himself the Great Carsoni with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who has not yet learned that the world can refuse you. He served in the Navy, studied radio and speech, paid his dues through small markets and regional television, and by 1962 was sitting behind the desk of The Tonight Show as though he had always been there and always would be. What made him extraordinary was not any single skill but the combination, the timing that could not be taught, the ability to make 20 million people feel like he was talking specifically to them, the instinct for when to speak and when to let the silence do the work. What made him difficult was the same thing that made him great, refracted through the prism of his private life rather than his professional one. The need for control that made his show run like a precision instrument made his relationships brittle. The sensitivity to disruption that kept his stage immaculate made him incapable of processing betrayal, or anything he interpreted as betrayal, with any flexibility or forgiveness. He was married 4 times, and the marriages told a story about a man who was capable of deep feeling but constitutionally unable to let anyone close enough, for long enough, to make the feeling sustainable. He lost a son, Rick, in a car accident in 1991, and the grief that crossed his face when he returned to television was something the audience had never seen from him. A crack in the performance, a glimpse of the person behind the persona, and it was almost unbearable to watch precisely because it was so unfamiliar. When he retired in 1992, he walked away with a completeness that stunned the industry that had been built, in significant ways, around his continued presence. He moved to Malibu, bought a boat, and declined essentially every invitation to return, to guest, to comment, to reminisce, to participate in the ongoing conversation about his own legacy. The power he had wielded for 3 decades did not transfer to a successor. It simply ended, spreading out across a fracturing media landscape that was already becoming too diffuse, too plural, too resistant to centralized authority for anyone to occupy the position he had held. He died in January 2005, of emphysema, privately, without a farewell broadcast, without a final interview, without giving anyone else the opportunity to frame the ending. The man who had decided, for 30 years, who got to be heard and who did not, made the same decision about himself. He left behind no memoir, no definitive account, no version of events told in his own voice that might complicate or enrich or challenge the stories that other people told about him. He simply left. And the silence he left behind, vast, deliberate, impossible to fill, was the most Carson thing he ever did.